talk about the early development of Ibadi law in Oman, mainly from the second half of the 8th century to the first half of the 9th century. The slide on the screen shows the overview of my presentation. In the first section, introduction, I will mention the purpose and method of my presentation. In the second part, we will direct our attention briefly to some factors or elements which enable the scholarly movement and exchange among the Ibadi. In the third section, I will speak about the intellectual stage or level in Oman, taking Ibadi discussion mainly on family law as example. Finally, I will conclude my talk with several findings. Now, I begin with section 1, introduction. Modern scholars of Ibadis agree that Basra was an Ibadi center. The city occupied a significant position in Ibadi history, despite the fact that Ibadi community was small in number. Ibadi men came from various regions to Basra to study under distinguished landmen, while some remained after finishing their studies. Others returned to their homeland or headed to a new place to teach local people. Oman is a region that embraced Ibadism. Like the Ibadis in other regions, Omanis in the 8th century AD sent members to Iraq, including Basra. According to Abu Sa'id al-Qudami, al-Omani scholar in the 10th century, knowledge was little and of no use in the 8th century Oman. Hence, Ibadi jurists and scholars went to Iraq in search of the knowledge. After returning from Iraq, these men taught Omanis what they did not know. Then, throughout the second part of the 8th century into the 10th century, Ibadis in Oman worked to establish an Ibadi system of law and formulated their own legal doctrine, as the Sunni school of law did. Well, the transmission and reception of an idea do not always progress simply. Sometimes people may accept the idea uncritically, but other times may debate its validity. While Ibadis in Oman gained a vast amount of knowledge from Iraq, they may have practices and customs since they embraced Islam. Also, they did not only send their members, but also received migrants from outside Oman. Furthermore, some Omanis went to other cities like Mecca and appeared to learn from the Ibadis there. Thus, given the multiple way of exchanging knowledge, it is plausible that scholars in Oman studied all the various opinions closely, taking some ideas and rejecting others. So, what kind of ideas did the scholars who studied in Iraq bring to Oman? How Omani scholars responded to the ideas introduced from Iraq and other regions? Moreover, how did the migrants to Oman contribute to the establishment of an Ibadi legal system? Investigating such questions could explain not only the formation of Ibadi jurisprudence in Oman, but also help scholars understand the nature of Ibadi laws. So this study attempts to find some of above answer some of the above mentioned questions by focusing on interactions and discussion among Ibadi scholars. Most of the scholars in this study were active in the second half of the 8th century and first half of the 9th century. more specifically from the last quarter of the 8th century to the first quarter of the 9th century. By examining Arabic materials composed mainly in later Oman, I will show the dynamics of scholarly exchange in Oman. This slide on the screen shows the scholars and Arabic materials which I use and refer in this study. Then now we are moving to section second. A variety of factors appear to enable the Ibadis to move, transfer, and exchange opinions. Here I will pick up two factors or elements among them, namely ideological one and Ibadi attitudes towards different opinions. Ibadi scholars called on members to respect religious membership over tribal and family attachment. And this was a factor that encouraged scholars to exchange opinions regardless of their origins. Ibadi scholars requested members to share the value of loving other members on the basis of religion. For instance, Abu Ali ibn al-Husayn al-Ambari, a proto-Ibadi leader, once sat in a circle in the meeting. His brother Al-Hassan came from Iraq, while Abu al-Hull was in the circle. Abu al-Hull did not stand up and simply took his brother's hand. Shortly thereafter, an Omani came to Abu al-Hull. Seeing the Omani, Abu al-Hull stood up, withdrew from the circle, and embraced him and kissed both sides of his cheek. Then Abu al-Hull said to his brother Al-Hassan, "Loving this Omani was not just loving you, for loving him is based on religion, deen, while loving you is based on kinship, nasab." Through communication with other Ibadis, Omanis must have shared these values, or at the least they sympathized with members outside Oman. There was a debate in Oman. An Ibadi killed another Ibadi for an unknown reason. According to Hashim ibn Gailan, Shabib ibn Atiyah asserted that both of the two men were the holder of Walaya. On the other hand, Musa ibn Abi Jabir, one of the Hamalatul Ilm, asserted that the murderer was in a state of dissociation, Bara. Hashim supported Jabir's opinion. When Shabib said that he was afraid of schism or split, Hashim replied, "This is the opinion of your Iraqi brethren." Hashim's response to Shabib could be interpreted not only as a preference for Iraqi opinion, but also as his religious affinity toward Iraqi Ibadis, as the term Ikhwan suggests. In addition, while taking diverse opinions into consideration, as other Muslim groups did, the Ibadis in Oman take care not to escalate tensions in discussion among members. This attitude was crystallized in the phrase, "My saying concerning it is Muslims saying, Qawli fihi qawl al-Muslimin," which enables concerned parties to abstain from any further debate or argument. For example, Musa ibn Abi Jabir says, "Whenever Muslims have a debate over religion and opinion, they must return to the summary of Islam, Jumratul Islam. Then they must say, our belief concerning it is Muslims' belief, and our opinion is Muslims' opinion. If they do it, they do not go astray." Here, Musa ibn Abi Jabir urges members to abstain from escalating argument over religious or legal matters. Likewise, Hashim ibn Gailan says that his sheikh used to tell him that when people differed in opinion, people should suspend judgment and say that phrase. Hashim ibn Gailan then said that his sheikh lived according to this manner. Thus, the phrase contributed to control the escalation of debate through the concept of suspending judgment, wukuh. That phrase was also used to confirm the Ibadi membership. Musa probably ibn Abi Jabir explains that when Ibadi Muslims associated with a man, but an individual Ibadi dissociated from the man, the Ibadi Muslim must say that phrase, namely, my faith is Muslim faith and my saying is Muslim saying. According to Basil bin Munzir, one of the Hamlatul Ilm, when a man says the phrase, he has already associated with those with whom Ibadi associate. That phrase was essential for uniting the community as well as for confirming their identity. So it is difficult to, now we are moving to the main section of my presentation. It is difficult to confirm the extent of migration to Oman, since our sources seldom refer to where the scholars met each other. There might have been no single mass migration of Ibadi followers from Iraq to Oman. Instead, there may have been a small but continuous migration to Oman between the second half of the 8th century and the first half of the 9th century. As a result of sending members to Iraq, receiving opinions of migrants and visitors, Omani Ibadis got a rich amount of outward opinion. Their response towards them varied. Sometimes they preferred an opinion held by their master simply because their master held it. For instance, Sulaiman ibn Usman was asked a question on Salah. Sulaiman referred to two opinions, one by Wa'il ibn Ayyub al-Hadrami and Abu Muhajir Hashim ibn Muhajir al-Hadrami. The other by Musa ibn Abi Jabir and Basil ibn Munzir. And then asked about his opinion, Sulaiman became silent. Finally, he said, Musa and Basil were two sheikhs of Omanis. Take their opinion. Here, Sulaiman bin Usman seems to take the opinion simply because of their Omaniness. However, on another occasion, scholars acknowledged an opinion posed by scholars from outside Oman, and it became a new legal standard. Hashim ibn Gailan describes the case, saying that a man got married to a woman. Two witnesses came to her and informed her about the marriage. She kept silent. Hashim reports that as far as the virgin was concerned, the Omani people said that her silence illustrated his consent with the situation. Their opinion and practice changed when, according to Hashim ibn Gailan, Abu Muhajir al-Hadrami said that two witnesses would tell her then, we testify that you were satisfied with it. If you keep silence, it is the content and consent. If you reject it, it is for harm. Hashim reported that today people take that manner. As described, scholars in Oman examined opinions closely and integrated them into their mindset if they were beneficial. Then Abu Bakr Yahya bin Zakaria al-Mawsili and Abu Usman Sulaiman bin Usman and their contemporaries are good examples to help grasp the intellectual stage of legislation in Oman at that time. Abu Bakr Mawsili was from Mosul. He migrated in Taqala to Oman and died in Izki and was buried there. On the other hand, Sulaiman bin Usman was one of the leading scholars around the 800 era, Common Era. Born in Nizwa, he served as a Qadi of the Imam Ghassan bin Abdullah in Nizwa. It appeared to be during this time that he met Abu Bakr al-Mawsili. When examining the discussions between the two scholars and among their contemporaries, we can find the difference of opinions among them on the basis or on the ground of the methodology in deriving rules in Arabic rules. Here I will introduce some typical cases. Firstly, there was a difference of opinion caused by following assault, example or president, and employing lies, personal reasoning in deriving rules and applying it to the case. In other words, Ibadi scholars did not merely follow preceding opinions, but tried to derive rules using legal reasoning. In one episode, Abu Bakr al-Mawsili tested Abu Usman bin Usman whether he memorized the rule correctly or not, saying to his colleagues that if Abu Usman derives a conclusion through his personal reasoning right, he is wrong. He asked then Abu Usman about a man who divorced his wife but concealed it from her. After that, he asked him for a divorce in return for compensation. He accepted. When she knew that he had already repudiated her, she demanded her marriage portion and argued that she did not know that the divorce had happened. Sulaiman said that in that case, she had a right to her property. Abu Bakr then said to his colleagues, "Did I not tell you that if Abu Usman made a conclusion based on his personal reasoning, he is wrong? He is wrong." Then Abu Bakr said, "I have memorized the jurist teaching that is permitted and she has no right to remuneration." Here Abu Bakr al-Mawsili acted as a transmitter of preceding opinions, while Sulaiman bin Usman came to conclusions without relying on previous examples. In this case, Sulaiman bin Usman might not know the author or preceding examples in this case. However, although Sulaiman bin Usman's answer did not satisfy Abu Bakr al-Mawsili, his attempt to find another solution through personal reasoning can be seen as a combination and a positive one. Abu Bakr al-Mawsili was not a mere transmitter and a follower of preceding opinions. He also acted as the interpreter of Sharia and giver of new rules. His role shows the tension between following Athar and employing Qiyas analogy in Furu among the scholars. The typical example is the payment of the marriage portion, mahal or sadaq. It is reported that Basran Ibadi leader Abu Ubaida believed that a marriage portion could be postponed until a man married another woman in addition, took another woman as his concubine. A wife needed a servant, and so on. Musa ibn Abi Jabil and Al-Rabi ibn Habib also ruled in accordance with opinion. On the other hand, Abu Bakr al-Mawsi believes that since God allows men to marry 4 women, one wife could not have her postponed marriage portion when her husband married another woman. Here, Abu Bakr al-Mawsi did not rely on the previous opinion of Abu Ubaidah, but tried to derive a new rule by interpreting the Quran, chapter Nisa, ayah 3. Abu Bakr al-Mawsi's opinion did not get wide support, but survived in Ibadi literature as a minor valid analogy of the Quran. Furthermore, there was a difference of opinion on the ground of the antinomy in employing analogy and using personal reasoning. We can see this in the problem of minimal marriage portion. Among the opinions, Musa ibn Abi Jabil asserted that the minimal marriage portion was 10 dirhams, while Abu Usman believes the minimal payment was 4 dirhams, by which the hard punishment that occurred was 4 dirhams. As is generally known, the minimum value of stolen goods provided the starting point for fixing the minimum marriage portion by analogy. Shahat expressed that the original Iraqian reasoning was an arbitrary lie. Musa ibn Abi Jabil, who believed the minimum was 10 dirhams, a belief also ascribed to Ibrahim Nahai, seems to take the arbitrary lie. On the other hand, Malik ibn Anas, that one believed that 1/4 dinar was the minimum value which necessitated the hard punishment. Although the price was different, Abu Usman's way of deriving a rule was similar to that of Malik ibn Anas. And it is interesting that in the above-mentioned case on the minimum marriage portion, Musa ibn Abi Jabil took the arbitrary lie, while Abu Usman applied the reasoning. According to old assumption in Islamic law history, the two oldest schools, Hanafis and Malikis, came into existence as the representative of the legal tradition of a particular geographical locality. Omanis, often had the opportunity to meet Ibadis in Mecca. Our sources sometimes refer to the Ibadis there. Being wedged between Iraq and Hijaz, Omanis might have had a choice of Hijazi opinion. As a matter of fact, Al-Shakashi refers to a difference of opinion concerning the arms of camels and cattle, noting that Abu Bakr al-Mansuri agreed with the Iraqis, while Sulaiman bin Usman agreed with the Hijazi interpretation. So, of course, a similarity in opinion does not necessarily mean that one applies the view from the other. What follows is an attempt to discover the Iraqi and Hijazi influence on Imani opinions. I'd like to skip this discussion, but on the marriage contract, Musa ibn Abi Jabil's opinion as that of the Ahlul Rai while Raymond Usman's opinion was similar to that of the judges. So, furthermore, I'm going to the next stage. Ibadis also in Oman also consulted with the opinions, for example, in Khorasan. For example, Musa ibn Ali followed the Khorasani opinion on the case in which a man expressed the word of the divorce 3 times, but he intended 1 divorce. Furthermore, Ibadi scholars also consulted the writing of contemporary non-Ibadis, asked about the case in which a man left the right of repudiation to his wife, after which they became drowsy, nuance, slept, and when he woke up, she repudiated herself. A certain Hashim, most probably Hashim ibn Gailan, answered that we found in the writing of Ahl Qibla that drowsiness nuance did not bring divorce. When the questioner continues to ask him whether Hashim takes this opinion or not, Hashim answers, yes, my heart accepted it. This expression, Ahlul Qibla, means non-Ibadis in Ibadi terminology. So now I'd like to summarize my presentation concerning the early development of Ibadi law in Oman. Results reveal that the Ibadis in Iraq and Oman in the concerned period shared the importance of association with their members based on religion. In addition, the Ibadi scholars took diversity and disagreement among opinions for granted. They established a rule of using the phrase, my saying concerning it is Muslims saying, and so on. To prevent the escalation of argument, that phrase provided Ibadi followers an identity as an Ibadi. Such attitude and rules must have been of factors that helped the Ibadis move across the regions and exchange opinions in each other. During the early development of Ibadi law in Oman, the Omani attitude toward outward ideas and opinions varied. In other words, Omani scholars were not mere recipients of the different thought. Rather, they had an independent stance. They closely examined rules, opinions, and ideas and took the best ones at that time. Scholars in this paper derived rules by following the previous examples as well, employing personal reasoning and using analogies. The method not only of Iraqis but also of Hijazi people seems to have an impact and influence on the thinking of some Omani Ibadis. Furthermore, some Ibadi scholars in Oman took the opinions of the Khorasani Ibadis and even non-Ibadis into consideration. Thus, Oman in the concerned period was the meeting point of various legal doctrines. While Ibadi jurisprudence may have been independent from the beginning, it has also always existed within an environment of intercommunication with non-Ibadis. As revealed in this study, the second half of the 8th century AD and the first half of the 9th century AD was a significant period for the formation of the Ibadi legal system in Oman. A close examination of the legal system leads us to acquire a better understanding of Ibadi law at that time, which will subsequently elucidate the nature of Islamic law. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Our second speaker today is Professor Ahmed Abul Wafa, professor from the Cairo University Faculty of Law.
It is for me a great pleasure and honor to participate in this conference. Being invited to this conference, I would like firstly to address my thanks to the Minister of Work, the top of which is His Excellency the Minister, Sheikh Abdullah Mohammed Al-Salimi. As well, my thanks are addressed to the organizers of this conference, and especially Dr. Abdulrahman Al-Salimi. My intervention for today is related to the homeland and location concept in the body jurisprudence. You all know that Muslim law admits the existence of locations and territories affiliated to Muslim states and to other states. And my intervention in this regard will focus on two essential points: the essence of location and homeland in the body jurisprudence, and the consequences resulting therefrom. So I begin by the first point, the essence of location and homeland in the body jurisprudence. And in this regard, scholars in the body jurisprudence are focused essentially on 4 points. Number one, the admission of the territory as a state component by the body jurisprudence. So it is narrated by Muhammad ibn Mahbub that it is not permissible to transfer the Muslim land to infidels, hostile people. This shall not be revoked if done, unless someone did as Prophet Muhammad did exactly the same. When he conquered Khyber, he gave the law to the Jews that property, that they should work in it for half of its harvest. Omar as well conquered Madain, and then he returned it to the Jews to work on it. So the land is a component of the state, as is the case now, because as you all know, a state is usually composed of 3 elements: the territory, the population, and the sovereign authority. The second point, homeland occupancy. In fact, Buddhism spoke about homeland occupancy, i.e., a person who occupies a homeland other than his own in which a distance exists about 6 miles, he must shorten the prayers. To Ibadism, the occupancy of a homeland is an obligation, so it is a divine precept. In fact, no homeland under Ibadi jurisprudence, no homeland for the world occupant, so a person cannot occupy the whole world. Third point, Ibadi jurisprudence admits boundaries between states. As you all know, a boundary line separates 2 states, in which it has a double function. In fact, on a boundary, the sovereignty of a state ends, and that of another state begins. Ibadi scholars to recognize boundaries in this context. Evidence is as follows. One of the functions of the state, according to Ibadi scholars, is the safeguard of those areas bordering other states. Also, Al-Warjulani, as you all know, pointed out the 7 territories and the equator. The fourth point in this first item, abodes or dars in Ibadi jurisprudence. And here I will refer to some points, how to define the dar, types of dar, and transformation of the dar. With regard to the qualification, in fact, the body jurisprudence takes into account the fact that qualification of a dar is based on its people and who they are as far as justice and oppression are concerned. Accordingly, dars may be divided into three main categories: dar of justice or Muslim dar, in which the Islamic rule is prevailing; dar of oppression or hostile dar or theistic dar, in whose inhabitants disobey the Muslim state; and the mixed dar, in which those two categories exist. This how the Bayan al-Shara states: if a state comprises both those who go astray and those who are righteous, it is therefore a mixed dar. With regard to the transformation of a dar may be transformed into a Muslim style or mixed one under two conditions according to the body jurisprudence. On the one hand, the occurrence of a change or transformation within the concerned dar, and in the second hand, the stability of such transformation or change. This is the first point, the sense of location and homeland in the body jurisprudence. I move now to the second topic, examined by body scholars, that is consequences resulting from location and homeland. And here as well, there are 4 points examined by body authors. The first one is related to the principle of territoriality. In fact, as you all know, the rule is that state's jurisdiction is determined by its territorial boundaries, and in this regard, the Permanent Court of International Justice has affirmed that jurisdiction is essentially territorial. With regard to body scholars, they have put some rules related to the territoriality principle. It suffices to mention 2. The first is that the dar rules apply to the inhabitants of that dar, and the second is related to the fact that the dar rule is affiliated to the rule of the ruler. With regard to the domains concerning this principle of territoriality, body scholars examine 6 points: territoriality of jurisdiction with regard to crimes and punishments, territoriality concerning what must apply in wartime, territoriality concerning the applicability of laws in general, and the applicability of laws with regard to foreigners, territoriality jurisdiction pertaining to financial matters. Suffices to mention here what Mukhtar bin Auf stated: we shall not collect a tax from whom that our rule does not cover. So, protection of those from which we can take taxes is essential for taking taxes from them. Also, body scholars spoke territoriality, jurisdiction related to the enforcement of foreigners, as I have just mentioned it. And finally, with regard to territoriality, they put forward the possibility to derogate from the principle of territoriality by applying the rule that states a Muslim is bound to observe Islamic law wherever he is. This is the first point. Second point, the first consequence. The second consequence is related to location and rules of residence. And I will speak here, I will examine here 2 points. Rules governing residence in a non-Muslim country and residence of non-Muslims in a Muslim country. With regard to the first point, the rules governing residence in a non-Muslim country, I can say that there are essentially four tendencies in Ibadi jurisprudence. The prevailing approach, no residence is permitted in a non-Muslim land. The second supports the possibility of residing in a non-Muslim state. The third one supports the detestation to seek refuge in a non-Muslim state unless one is forced to do so. And finally, the fourth approach supports the possibility to reside in a non-Muslim state as long as a Muslim is confident of the safety in his belief. With regard to non-Muslims in a Muslim country, Ibadi jurisprudence recognizes the existence of non-Muslims in the midst of Ibadi Muslims. And in this regard, the Ibadi jurisprudence says that foreigners, that is non-Muslims, must obey to the Muslim state imam or Muslim state leader. And it suffices in this regard to mention what Ibn Barakah has said. It is equally, quote, it is equally obligatory to foreigners to obey the imam without having the necessity to know him by a just evidence. His head attire is enough for them to recognize him among his masses with his order execution authority. The third consequence concerning my topic is the observance of the principal pacta sunt servanda, even outside the Muslim land. And accordingly, it is narrated that the people of the covenant were, if they were overburdened by tax payment or any payment, they then sought refuge of hostile people, and then Muslims appeared in that state. They are not to be taken captives in respect of the covenant, previous covenant concluded with them. So the covenant must be fully honored and applied even in such a case. The fourth consequence is the location or homeland and hostile relations in Ibadi jurisprudence. And in this regard, I will examine or refer to 2 points. The first one, the imposition of a ban on arms to export to enemy positions or locations. And here there is a difference between peacetime and wartime. With regard to peacetime, it is possible, permitted to export arms to a non-Muslim state unless such export is meant to strengthen their position, whereas during wartime it is totally prohibited to export such arms, and this is, as you all know, an application of the principle prevent is better than cure. With regard to the second point, it is related to the occupation of a Muslim territory. And in this regard, you all know that a territory is occupied if it is de facto under the control of the enemy. And in this regard, the Ibadi authors said that there are 3 essential rules related to an occupied territory. The first is related to the necessity to resist occupation by all possible means. The second one, no support should be provided to the occupying authorities through working with them, whereas finally the third one is that related to the prohibition to join the occupation army. Those are the main points that I have put before you. My conclusion is the following. It is clear, it is clear from what has been mentioned now that the Ibadi jurisprudence set definite and certain norms regarding location and homelands, established such norms to be implemented not only in relations within the state, but also externally in certain circumstances. Thirdly, number 3, emphasizes the fact that such norms are general ones to be implemented in normal circumstances yet one can violate them when necessity so compels. In fact, this is an application of the well-recognized rule, necessity knows no law, so, i.e. necessities permit committing the forbidden. Number 4, conclusion number 4, Ibadi jurisprudence mentioned these norms in a manner that does not differ wholly and generally from those implemented at present in contemporary legal systems. And finally, Ibadi jurisprudence affirmed that legal rules related to homeland and location are not the invention of a certain civilization or of some states, the Western or Eastern ones. Other civilizations participated in the formation of such rules, amongst which Muslim civilization, in which Ibadi jurisprudence is a branch. I am very thankful to you for your patience and have a good day.
Thank you.
Our third speaker today is Muhammad Sheikh, and actually there's a correction in the title of this presentation. It's Ibadi community between identity and difference, not differentiation. He is a professor in Hassan al-Thani University, Faculty of Humanities.
In his book written in 1703 and published post-mortem in 1765, the famous German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Leibniz features two protagonists who discussed the issue of the nature of the things. At one point, Theophilus, one of the protagonists and supposed to be the spokesman of the philosopher, explains to Philaeteles, supposed to be his protagonist, the ultimate principle of Leibniz's philosophy called the principle of indiscernibles. This principle will be formulated later in the monology of Leibniz as follows. There is never in nature two beings that are perfectly alike, and in which it would not be possible to find a difference. In this respect, Theophilus comes to the idea of illustrating this principle by the following anecdote. An ingenious gentleman of my acquaintance, discussing with me in the presence of Her Electoral Highness the Princess Sophia in the garden of Herrenhausen, thought he could find two leaves perfectly alike. The princess defied him to do it, and he ran all over the garden for a long time to look for some. But it was to no purpose. 2 drops of water or milk viewed with a microscope will appear distinguishable from each other. Could such a thing be imagined to happen in the classical Muslim world? Let us consider this challenge in details. The challenge is whether classical Arab thinkers have thought the difference or not. But what is thinking difference? And at what level to think it? Sociological, political, religious, ontological, theological? It is often argued that classical Arab thinkers have succumbed to the fascination of the one, the like, the unique, the same, in short, the identical. and that they were afraid of the plural, the different, the various, as the devil is afraid of holy water. Has not the Muslim religion been considered in the end as a religion of the one? And it was thus that classical Arab thinkers were considered as thinkers who were so fascinated by the identical that they erected it in a slogan: one God, one religion, one community. Finally, does not this fascination with the one, in the face of the realities of history and the facts of politics, seem to be comparable to an unrealizable ideal or a Platonic idea that has deteriorated, or even to a lost paradise? For anyone who knows the tradition of classical Arab thought, this cliché, shared by almost everyone, sees in Arabic thought a uniform and uniformizing thought that has almost sacrificed the one, the identical, the like, and never cared about the plural, the different, the dissimilar, the diverse. This man seems not to account for the diversity and the richness of this tradition. Certainly, at first sight, this thought offers the landscape of an unifying, leveling, uniformizing, which has sought everywhere the one, the identical, and the like, even where they are not to seem to be. It may also be considered that classical Arab thinkers seem to have succumbed to the fascination of the one, the identical, and the same at several levels. The first level, at the theological level, classical Arab theologians have venerated the one and have seen in the word, as diverse as it may be, the sign of the one. When they encountered the plural, they energetically rejected it. The true cannot diversify. It can only be on the side of a party, only which party is supposed to possess the true, the lucky party, al-firqa al-najiya. All theological schisms have monopolized the epithet, the people of truth, Ahlul Haqq. At the second and philosophical level, however, the real headache for the Arab philosophers was to explain how the diverse, the world in its diversity, can emanate from the one, while presupposing that the one must be the principle, the original, and the rule, and the diverse, if it exists, must be considered the secondary, the derivative, the illusory. Therefore, classical Arab theology appears to be as the ontology of the one. Traditional Arab political and social theory seems to develop a theory of identity, one God, one religion, one community. What is then the ontological, political, ethical, and social status of the different, the diverse, and the plural? To tell the truth, this image that has glued so much to classical Arab thought, like its skin, needs to be corrected. On the contrary, classical Arab thought was not all uniform, all unifying. There are, of course, exceptions. Let us elaborate on this by choosing some illustrations that illustrate our refusal of generalization. At the level of social philosophy, some Arab philosophers have founded the relationship with others, as in the case of friendship, not on agreement, but on difference. Abu Hayyan Tawhidi said, when you find people who look so similar to being the same, Indeed, this similarity hides the difference. According to him, friendship is founded not on the resemblance of characters, but on the contrary, on their dissimilarity. He illustrates his remarks with examples drawn from his entourage of very different friends and yet great friends. His master, Abu Hassan al-Amiri, said, when things seem to resemble one another, it is there where the difference is very hard to notice, and this is also when one is likely to be misled. The Muslim mystics were, in turn, very concerned about the difference hidden in identity. Ibn Arabi had the happy formula that equals in depth the formula of the principle of the indiscernibles without losing on the rhetorical level. Nature does not generate twins. فالطبيعة لا تلد التوأم. The Moroccan mystic Zarouk used to say, two persons cannot agree on one thing in all its details, even if they agree on its origin or on one of its particularities or of one of its modalities. That is why the saints have said, two ways, the ways to God cannot be counted by their infinite number. The Egyptian mystic Ali ibn Wafa said, where a resemblance is erected in principle, one must seek dissimilarity. Even in the field of jurisprudence, scholars have erected difference, not identity, as one great principle. If you find two things that are perfectly alike, you must be wary of this false resemblance and seek the points where they diverge, even in the manner of designating them. And the great jurist consultant Ash-Shatibi gives the example of two dirhams which seem to resemble one another while one is lawfully earned, the other is not. Now let us talk about the three topics of my intervention. The first topic is the case of Ibadi identity, some preliminary reflections. If we borrow names that the Ibadis used to give themselves willingly, we note that the identity of Ibadis took two forms. The first form is a form of repulsive or negative identity. There are two types of this kind of identity. One, the Kharijite identity that the Ibadis have energetically challenged throughout their history. Two traits of this identity pose challenge for them: excommunication, takfir, and violence, al-qatl. The Ibadis never wanted to be identified ipso facto with a community with the sad celebrity of being an excommunicating and violent community with an identity known to be deadly. They accept, on the contrary, a community that is believed to be persecuted and bruised. Indeed, this rejected identity has become the shadow of the desired one. The Ibadis have so much rebelled against their identification with this unloved identity. And yet, how many historians of ideas have pushed them to this cursed identity? And how many efforts have been made to reject the amalgam between these two identities? The repelled, the Kharijite one, and the desired one, the Ibadi identity. Two, the intrusive identities that come to proclaim themselves of the mother identity, if one dares to say, without having the legitimacy to do so. The example that can illustrate this case is the example of the schism called Umayyah, Abu Zakaria said, there is a schism which has borrowed the name of the Ibadis and is called Umayyah. We are not at all in agreement with them on a consensual word from the beginning. Yet, they claim to be Ibadis. They are the followers of Isa ibn Umayr, and we will explain their doctrine and answer them with regard to their difference with the contents of the two مع أهل الحق يعني الإباديين. Thus we perceive that identity is a more complicated game than it seems to be. It is plural game, false identity, self-proclaimed identity, pseudo-identity, exalted identity. The second form of the identity of Ibadis is an identity desired and eagerly pursued. Like the rejected identity, the desired identity of Ibadis has several facets. One, the theological facet of the Ibadi identity emerges when they are called Ahl al-Haq, at the risk of appearing exclusivists. But this appellation is not an exception. It has been, in the classical works of Islamic theology, commonplace among all theological sects. A simple glance at the works of polemical theology shows to what extent classical theologians were not relativists, as contemporary theologians are struggling to be, and did not hesitate to claim that they were the only ones to hold the truth. The books of the Ash'arites, like those of the Mu'tazilites and even of the Yazidi, are full of that appellation of which they reserve the exclusivity and honor. Not only did the Ibadis pretend to be rightful and consequently prided themselves of being al-Haq, but they preserved the exclusivity of being al-Muslimun, the sole true Muslims. Secondly, at the judicial level, the Ibadis saw themselves as a doctrine, madhab. They generally recognized that they were a madhab. They suggested that they tolerate other madhabs, provided they are theologically under the same banner of Islam. At the social and moral level, the Ibadis considered themselves as community, but not any community. They were the Muslim community, Jama'at Muslimin, as they also defined themselves as the people of preaching, Ahl Da'wah, more precisely, Ahl Da'wat al-Muslimin. In sum, from an exogenous point of view, the Ibadi identity has established itself against other Muslim theological, political, and jurisprudential obedience. Ibadis defined themselves as Ahl al-Haq against Ahl al-Tawheed. That is to say, those Muslims whose theological, political convictions they did not share. From indigenous point of view, the Ibadis defined themselves against their adversaries, Wahbiya against Nukkar, often calling them al-Mukhalifin. My second topic is about the identity of the North African Ibadi communities. This identity, assuming that there is one and not several, has been defined first of all by the reaction to identity of the communities of the West, not in a logic of adversity, but in a logic of avoidance. Thus, when the first North African Ibadi Imam was named, Abu al-Khattab, who was strongly solicited by the representatives of the community while he did not want the post, it is reported that those who solicited and choose him for his mandate will have said to him, the moral obligation to manage the affairs of the Muslims is yours. And when he realized the seriousness and their designation and their insistence after his long refusal, he laid down a condition to accept that post. He would have said to them, provided you do not invoke the case of Al-Harith and Abdul Jabbar. Abu Zakaria commented on that condition, saying, for fear of creating discords and splits within Muslims, such an affair must be categorically ignored. This reminds us of the discovery of irrational numbers by the Pythagorean community. As they discovered the irrational in mathematics, the perfect model of rationality, which was tantamount to a scandal, and resigned themselves to hide in it, Ibadi community discovered the dispute in the community and resigned themselves to silence. And as for the Pythagoreans, the irrational leads reason to be scandalous. For the Ibadis, the dispute is a scandal to union. Saving a unified and unbroken identity, then, is tantamount to submitting to a prohibition. But how can it go? The man by whom the scandal derived, the undesirable guest already knocked at the door. The investiture of Imam Abu Khattab took place under a slogan that forged the Ibadi identity of the North African community. There is no commandment but that of God. There is no obedience but that granted to Abu Khattab. This way, the identity of community was forged on a theological-political basis. My third topic is about an identity under tension. Religious identity, especially in small communities under threat of imminent invasion, often becomes too rigid. But politics has its own realm. It does not obey the good intentions, the solid theological architectonic, the strict conduct in accordance with the most orthodox precept. Politics is neither the art of perfection, nor the art of truth, nor the art of honesty. It is the art of the possible. In the field of politics, alliances have often been seen to contract, to break down, and to recast themselves according to the interest of the allies. The politician, unlike the religious imam, often has to make hidden alliances, painful compromises, suspicious arrangements, difficult consensus. He sometimes has to resort to tricks, subterfuges, maneuvers, which come into conflict with the rigidity of the precepts of the religious dogma. The tragedy of identity is played out under the auspices of the comedy of politics. As in any history of religious community, there is no happy ending. There is only, if one dares to say, a happy beginning, which is often seen through the prism of the myth of the glorious past. Therefore, when evaluating the mandate of Abu Khattab, Abu Zakaria wrote, he, Abu Khattab, was not the cause of any split supposed to come to strike the Ibadi community at that time. The community was unified and united. No rebel shows opposition against him. Who to the world because of scandals? For it must needs be that scandals come. But nevertheless, who to that man by whom the scandals commit? But the most dreadful thing happened. The split ended up prevailing. The tragedy of identity began. Often the scandal comes through a conflict between political theology, which highlights for foreigner as Imam the case of Abdurrahman bin Rustam, to caution tribal conflicts of interest, ambitions and desires, and tribalism, nepotism, and opportunism. The investiture of the second Imam Abdul Wahhab after the death of the first Imam Rustumid Abdurrahman ibn Rustum speaks volumes. Some Ibadis, for instance, Abu Qudama, who wanted to become the Imam and failed because of lack of support, referred Abdul Wahhab to a certain Mas'ud who was recalcitrant by referring to the tribal lineage of the former, who was deemed to be the grantor of favors granted. But since they were suspicious of their elected representative, they asked him for guarantees, conditional alliance. This was the beginning of the first schism within Rustumid Ibadism. That schism was due to a conflict between, on the one hand, the theological political dogma governing by following the Quran, the Sunnah, and the tradition of the Prophet's companions, and on the other hand, the sense of tribalism, conflicts of interests, ambitions, desires, favoritism, nepotism. In short, the vicissitude of the political field represented by Abu Qudama and Yazid ibn Fardin, which preempted the demand for a collegial government based on the consultation of a council, the pretext conditional allegiance, which was brandished at all times as the Damocles sword, became then a means of a political ploy or political stratagem. This stratagem has been duplicated by another theological political subterfuge, the famous question of the institution of the least knowledgeable man when the most knowledgeable man is not lacking, which might seem to be a religious question, but for innocent. The rest of the story is we know, the appeal to the jurisdiction of the Ibadi scholars of the East, but the evil has already seized identity, the schism is already at the threshold, the undesirable host has interfered in the community and undermined the fragile identity. To sum up a little bit, either in the West or in the East, the Ibadi identity, based on a theological jurisprudential foundation, was at the mercy of political ambitions hidden beneath theological quarrels. In the West, Oman, it had to yield to an alternation imamate sultanate. In the West, it has succeeded only once setting up its state, and it has been forced to live clandestinely for ages. Even nowadays, it is still struggling to consolidate itself, even if the theological political quarrels seem to be appeased by the unifying force of the nation state. Thank you.
I'm really grateful for all the speakers that are sticking to the time schedule. There's also a change in our program. The printed last lecture has been cancelled. And actually, Amanda Frost, who is a PhD candidate from Florida State University, will be talking today about the place of the Prophet Muhammad and early about it.
I'd like to start with thanking the ministry and the organizers of the conference for making it possible, and emphasize a particular gratitude that I have for being included as a graduate student. I think it's a real privilege to be here as a graduate student, so thank you. And then second, I'm so sorry to be the final barrier between us and the next people. Very, very sorry about that. I'm going to be talking about the image of the Prophet Muhammad in early Islamic CR. Two of the most familiar genres that pertain to the prophet, that is the collections of hadith and the prophetic sirah, are absent from the Ibadi corpus prior to the period of madhabization identified by Wilkinson and Geiser. The absence of these genres that focus on the prophet in early Ibadi works led me to ask how the image of the prophet functions in these texts. If the form and function of the document is distinct from these two genres, is the form and function of the Prophet Muhammad, or the image of the Prophet Muhammad, distinct as well?
The
Does
voice,
absence-
please. Amanda, the voice.
I'm sorry?
The voice.
The microphone? Will I move it? Is that help?
Like island. Yes.
Does that help?
You're going to be like Adam. Okay.
Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Maybe just bring it down to just a
Like
little bit so
that.
the game's right at your face.
I have to move it. Better?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so if the form and function of the document is distinct from these two genres, is the form and function of the Prophet Muhammad or the image of Prophet Muhammad distinct as well? Does the absence of these genres of large-scale hadith collections and prophetic sirah, despite being known to the Ibadis, mean that the reports about and biography of the Prophet is less important? Does it mean that the Sunnah of the Prophet is less important? In short, no. The Prophet is not less important. The Prophet is very important in these texts. However, in contrast to the genres that explicitly focus on him in that way, his role and function in the Siyar is distinct. I believe that these texts demonstrate that the Prophet is not elevated as a unique concern, yet they show that he was vitally important to the early Ibadi communities responsible for their production. Portrayed as one significant figure among several significant figures and concepts, the image of the Prophet functions as a literary device that furthers the narrative of each Sirah while demanding considerable, and this is significant, considerable prior knowledge about him in order to make anything comprehensible. It is both his function as a literary device that furthers the agenda of the narrative and the unspoken background knowledge required by the addressees of these documents to demonstrate his importance in the text. These texts do not contain a recognizable collection of hadith or prophetic sirah, as I said. This is not to say that reports about the Prophet Muhammad, those hadith, are absent. They contain many. However, they usually appear without isnad or source, and again, there does not appear to be a standard collection of them to which Ibadis refer until centuries later. The Prophet, then, appears in the Ibadi Siyar in a different role and for a different purpose than in the Sunni tradition, or what would become the Sunni tradition. To show the way that the image of the Prophet functions as a literary device, with the time that I have today, I'll limit my examples to two Siyar, the Epistle of Salim ibn Aqwan, as well as the Kitab Ahdath Sifat of Al-Muqtir and Sallallahu Alaihi. Each text, though from different periods, talk about Muhammad. Each text talks about Muhammad in a slightly different but complementary way. Ibn Aqwan includes the Prophet in the second part of his epistle and the mission topos. This is in advance of his main themes, which are, as we know, polemical refutations of his enemies, religious extremists. Muhammad's behavioral examples provide structure for his epistle and are used as foils to the behavior of those whom Ibn Aqwan condemns. In Abu Muqtir's later discussion of the Ibadi imamate, Muhammad is relevant not only for his religious significance, but as the political founder of the Muslim state, of course. Here too, his behavior is used as foil to the bad behavior of Abu Muqtir's enemies. So the Sirah of Salim ibn Aqwan, following Conan Zimmerman, dates the second half of the 2nd, 8th century. Its goal is discrediting the extremist Kharijites and Murji'ites. After his pious introduction and before his polemics against his doctrinal enemies, the author establishes a basis for his polemical argument by outlining the history and significance of the prophets leading up to Muhammad, and then a historical survey of Muslim political leaders after the Prophet, up to the First Civil War. Most space in this historical survey is devoted to Ahmed. In this section, he invests authority over the social significance of the Quran via following the correct example in two places, Muhammad and then the community. First, Muhammad is situated within the line of the prophets who came before him. God sends a new prophet to confirm those who came before and to follow their example. This leads into the section explicitly on Muhammad, which contains no surprising biographical information as credits have been known. Instead, he followed the example of those whom God had guided before him. His role is defined by what he taught, to tell them what came before him, to judge between them in disputes, to teach about the afterlife and judgment. Most importantly, he calls them to follow the Quran. The major biographical events in his life are reduced into a period during which God did not prescribe for him fighting, and a period after which when he did. These are not detailed. The information that Ibn Baqwan presents about Muhammad functions to point to the highlights relevant to his narrative that he's presented. God in this passage is directly involved with the actions of Muhammad, and those actions are centered around the authority of the Quran. In fact, the author contextualizes biographical information about the Prophet of the Quran very explicitly, so he continued as long as God wished to proceed on the basis of these and similar passages of the Quran, fighting the polytheists who fought him, and making treaties with those who undertook not to support an enemy against him. Muhammad's agency allows him to manage the issue of application, so when a verse is sent down that conflicts with an earlier one, he can apply the new rule appropriately. Muhammad is established then as an authority over the enforcement of the Quran, as well as a political leader of the nascent community, but his primary function is to let the Quran be the judge and imam of the community. The most important aspect of the image of the Prophet in the letter is his function as a counter to later discussions about correct behavior. The only actual rulings discussed in this section about Muhammad are those which will be relevant in the author's polemical arguments later. The structure strengthens the quality of his argument against the extremist Harjites. Prefiguring his later discussion, Salam notes that the Prophet would kill a user of his qibla if he was guilty of a capital offense, along with several important conditions that accompany this permitted killing. No enslavement of the offspring of the executed, no property taken, the executed wife must complete a waiting period before remarriage. Throughout the epistle, when this set of conduct is described, Salam lists these conditions. This conduct, sirah, is established as correct for dealing with troublesome members of the people of the qibla, and is presented here as sunnah. At the end of Muhammad's life, Salam focuses on the transfer of the example from the Prophet to the community by noting that God did not take him away until the religion had been perfected, and that the Muslims had understood the laws of guidance. The example that had been embodied in the Prophet becomes the responsibility of the community. Thus, he ordered them to follow his example, just as he ordered him to follow the example of those whom God had guided before him. Leading to the Quranic verse 690, those are they whom God has guided, so take their guidance as your example. The absolute significance of the Quran to the Prophet's mission, that is perhaps of greater significance than any other element of the Prophet's biography, is summarized at the end of the section on Muhammad. Muhammad, heeding God's warning of the trial with which he was going to test the believers, held so fast to the book which God had sent down to him that it saved him from the test, fitna, and he was so content with it as a guide that he proceeded in fear of what God had asked him to fear, and in pursuit of the good that God had asked him to pursue. Here, this test has been avoided by the tenacity with which Muhammad used the Quran as a guide. This point, too, serves the narrative because it contrasts with the time when the fitna did occur later historically. So the fact that the word fitna is used in reference to something that did not happen during the life of the Prophet, but could have, is significant because it demonstrates that Ibn Baqwan is using the word in the sense of test or trial, not as it was used in reference to civil wars or strife. Tayyib's discussion of the multiple shades of the word's meaning in Tabari shows that this is a possibility, and it seems that Salam is using the word in this sense here. Only Muhammad's steadfastness and dedication to the Quran prevented a fitna in his own lifetime, according to Salam's interpretation, suggesting that it was fully possible for the trial to occur for Muhammad. This very possibility is contrary to the idea that the community breaks up only after the Prophet's death in reaction to his death. So Muhammad's attachment to the Quran prevented a fitna during his own lifetime. His being spared does not automatically transfer to the leaders who come after him, as shown, of course, by the First Civil War. Rather than political leaders following Muhammad being invested with this responsibility over living closely to the Quran, it transfers to the community. For instance, at the beginning of the Sirah, the author implores, Take then the book of God as your guideline and heed what God has asked you to heed. God sent his messenger to be obeyed and set down his book to be followed and to judge between people and their disagreements. The language is very similar to the way Muhammad is described as interacting with the Quran, but here it is the community being asked to lead the book. The author continues that the book should be the only guide, for he who is not guided by it will not be guided by anything else. Additionally, it is for you to follow the good path of the conduct approved in Islam, which was followed by God's prophet and God's allies, awliya. Islam sets out correct conduct. Muhammad follows the conduct prescribed for him. In other words, Muhammad does not necessarily originate correct conduct. He simply does not require community consultation to know what it is, as his successors do. I do require community consultation. He makes use of consultation, but he's not required to. His successors are required to do so in order to be legitimate. The section on the caliphs which follows begins with the investment of the community in a political leader to follow the prophet. The prophet specifically does not make the selection himself. That's emphasized. The believers, after Muhammad's passing, decided that the best way to perfect their religion, remain united, and maintain God's command would be to appoint a commander to fulfill the tasks of leadership, namely following the book of God, carrying out God's command, imposing the hudud, and levying punishments, and dividing revenues. God guided them into choosing the most outstanding, of course Abu Bakr, who then acted rightly by taking the Quran as his imam, following the sunnah of the prophet, and by keeping in mind that God would question him over his leadership. There is no mention of Salam's key concept of treatment of members of the Qawm, because Abu Bakr adhered to the correct behavior, following Muhammad, and as such, no mention needed to be made, it didn't come up. Furthermore, there is no mention of Abu Bakr expanding the sunnah because, again, he didn't need to. He had enough precedent. He had enough case material. Crucially, the description of Umar's rule integrates the community and broadens the concept of sunnah to its general understanding of comprising both prophetic and caliphal precedent. After consulting with the Muslims, he appointed Umar ibn Khattab to succeed him as caliph. Umar acted in accordance with the book of God, followed the sunnah of God's messenger, and adopted the sunnah of Abu Bakr. However, he dealt with new issues not dealt with by Quranic pronouncements or prior sunnah, again significantly whether from the messenger of God or instituted by Abu Bakr. He instituted sunnah then about many new problems after consulting with the Muslims. The author approves of Umar's rule because he kept God's command and followed it in obedience to him, and because he consulted with the believers about matters arising, and acted in obedience to his Lord and follows the path of his two companions. The role of the community is important, and the distinction between the Prophet and Abu Bakr as political leaders is there softened. The Uthman saga is told in great detail because it has the most relevance for Salam's pronouncements against the extremists of his own time. He was appointed, Uthman was appointed after consultation with the Muslims and with their approval, and that he initially followed the Sunnah, but then he changed it by introducing bid'ah. The author outlines the myriad ways in which he did so, notably in part by dismissing knowledgeable companions of the Prophet. In a text that previously did not include too many specific names, here he gives many of the specific names of people wronged by Uthman or wrongly supported by Uthman. Significantly, instead of following the consultation of the community like his predecessors, he's corrected by the community, but he ignores them. The problem is that he's given consultation and he ignores it. After it is clear that he would not heed their correction, that's when they fought him. When he is killed, the Mekwen notes that they treated him and others killed in accordance with Muhammad's example. That is, the single example of conduct, actual conduct, given in the section on Muhammad on dealing with capital offenses. In regards to Ali, those who accepted the arbitration are shown as an example of the community failing to correctly manage their responsibility for interpretation of the Quran. They suspended God's judgment in this case, shunning it, and they distorted God's word by taking it out of context and interpreted the Quran in a sense other than that which it was sent down. Ultimately, at the conclusion of the Ali saga, we see the community established as Quranic interpreter and custodian. Then the Kharijite Muslims followed one another, adhering to that way. They would make God their sole judge and accept the path of the Muslims who had gone before them. Salam immediately follows this with the commitment of the Kharijite Muslims to not kill the offspring of the Qawm, take their property, or have sexual intercourse with their widows, again emphasizing those rules on which the extremist Kharijites differ. This shows a clear preoccupation with communal responsibility for understanding the Quran and correct behavior in relation to other Muslims,
Yes.
As Cronin Zimmerman pointed out, the ability to correctly interpret the Quran is incumbent upon the true Muslim community and sets them apart from the misguided Rashids and others. Moving on to Abu Muthar's epistle about the deposition of the Sultan Malik at the end of the 3rd, 9th century, it also begins with a general theological introduction affirming the nature of God and his prophet and the importance of spreading truth. Here he invokes Quranic verse 690 as well, just as it is by some of that one. Those are they whom God has guided, so take their guidance as your example. Abu Muthar here does not center this guidance around pious duties or following the lifestyle of the prophet, but rather, guidance is not by following the masses like those who pray and fast, but by following the example of the scholars, the Book of God, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and the Athar Salaf, whom God made carry religious knowledge. The community figures as both the first and last entry on the list of appropriate examples to follow according to the verse. Throughout the letter, the prophet is present but not central. A few times, a hadith is given to justify some or other assessment of the political actors under discussion in the deposition, but in no case is any source for the saying or isnad given. This is the same way that Selim reports something Muhammad said, such as when he refutes the Najdad's position that Hijra is not over by noting that Muhammad said that it was, without a source as to where this quotation comes from. And Abu Muthar, there are also oblique references to prophetic rulings, such as when a disabled man was dragged to his death by force under Musa and Musa Sami. When Musa was informed that this had happened, that the guy was dragged to his death, he did not denounce it or change policy. And Abu Muthar notes that the prophet forbade the mutilation of the dead, as I have heard, Fima Balagna, and dragging someone to death is mutilation. Here also, the behavior of Muhammad is used as a foil for the behavior of these enemies. The prophet is also present as a determinant of correct behavior in such instances as an extended discussion of the errors of Uthman. In regards to the technicalities of the prayers, Uthman prayed 4 rukas by Arafat during the pilgrimage against the Sunnah of the Prophet, leading into a discussion of Uthman disobeying the Prophet and occasioning the revelation of Quran Surah 72:23, that those who have disobeyed the Prophet will go to hell. Again, like with the other seerah, there's a huge amount of background knowledge that's required to make any sense of jumping straight into one of the specific errors that Uthman committed. The paragraph ends with a reference to the common people who have no ilm or knowledge of the Sunnah to Deen and Sirah to Muslimin, with the Prophet here sidelined. I mean, you don't always have to mention that the Prophet's involved in knowing what the correct religion is. In many cases where one might expect reference to the Prophet, instead Sunnah in general or the behavior of the community is emphasized. So since time is of the essence, to finish with some concluding thoughts, these questions left me with kind of 2 main ideas about the image and portrayal of the Prophet in this literature. First, the concept of fitna looms large, something that the Prophet could have encountered but didn't because of his cleaving to the Quran, and something that the Muslims later encountered because of the failure of some of them to accordingly cleave to the Quran. His behavior in regard to the Quran becomes a mechanism, or as I said earlier, a literary device, by which fitna is completely avoided, and then a mechanism by which it is overcome later by a certain group of people. This ties to the second idea that custodianship over and responsibility for cleaving to the book transfers to the community at large, not a human imam or individual, and that community is likewise defined by its relationship to the book.
Thank you, everyone. We have enough time for questions and answers, so if anybody has any particular question, please go ahead.
I can speak up. I have a question for Amanda.
Hi. I have a question for Amanda. So just to sort of make sure that I really understood what the essence is of what you're saying, if I were to look at your argument, or not flip it around, but just sort of rephrase it, would it be correct to say that what's missing, what would be present in say, Sunni or Shiite sources that's not present in these is constant reference to hadith as legal sources or as like sources of authenticity? What is it that's missing?
That seems fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the impulse to create a universal reference material. Yeah,
Okay, I just wanted to check that I've gotten.
that seems reasonable.
Oh, I know. I have to give this a distance to it. So thank you to all of you for a number of interesting presentations. I have a question, first of all, for Ahmed Al-Rufat. I was interested if you thought, I mean, the thing that struck me about your presentation was the use of a number of different, what I imagine to be very modern terms like territoriality and state in a pre-modern context, or maybe a temporal context that's not entirely clear to me. So I was, first of all, curious whether you saw any problem with the use of a term like state or territoriality in pre-modern context. And then secondly, perhaps you're actually talking about a more specific period of time. Yeah, I mean, in short, is it okay to use the term state and terms like state and territoriality in the pre-modern period, or to apply to the pre-modern period? And then secondly, for Amanda, I'm of course thinking of methodization when I was listening to this, and I was wondering if you thought calling the use of Muhammad as a historical example in this literature a literary foil is basically just changing form but not content in terms of the way the hadith is used also as a literary foil, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, with regard to your intervention, I think I have used both. In fact, my intervention was divided into two main points. The sense of the location and homeland, in which the term state may be used. It is used because the territory is one of the three elements necessary for the existence of a state. Whereas the term territoriality, referred to by you as well, is examined as a consequence of the existence of the state or of persons on the territory of the state. Yes?
I guess just maybe as a quick follow-up, it seems like the state as this, as a kind of all-powerful institution that has the power to control its borders, for example, and even define those borders.
This is inevitable, yes.
Yes. Worth problematizing.
Yes, yes.
About changing form, not content. I mean, if I had read Unlimited more, then I would speak more authoritatively about content. But I guess the content note is how laconic it is, right? So not only form, but also absence of content, or specific ways that content doesn't show up because of what's assumed.
Thank you. Really very interesting presentations, I can conclude. And I was very glad hearing the conclusion of Dr. Kondo about the qiyas as the dominating element in the Ibadi law in early period, because tomorrow I will be talking about the 19th century Ibadi law, and that is striking similarity or continuity that also qiyas is, so we can stress this fact of continuity in approaches in reasoning. And of course, the problem of homeland and state is to some extent controversial, but I mean that this is the question of the terms, mostly, of the terms, because if we look at the tribal division of any territory, territoriality was extremely important, so there were no borders in modern terms, or modern sense of this term, but each tribe defended its territoriality strongly. And probably the question of homeland, this is also the question of terms. Of course, as far as I understand English, so homeland doesn't mean la patrie, right? So, but of course, homeland is homeland. Yes, it could be our village and something. So this is this question. And I have only one question to Professor Sheikh about philosophical reflections, very interesting, but do they refer to particular, sorry? Do you refer to these reflections refer to particular period of the history, or they are general remarks? And as far as I follow the presentation of Amanda, very interesting. So I think that is a very important problem of kind of determinism to some extent, because as far as I understood, the Prophet Muhammad, his behavior was determined by Islam, and so what about his individuality as a human, and especially that according to Dr. Kondo, individualism was strongly expressed in the Ibadi law formation. So don't you think that here there is a kind of contradiction, or how to explain this? Thank you.
So any one of you who feels that they want to respond, please go ahead.
With regard to me, I agree with you that it is a question of terminology and terms used. But as well, if you permit, I think it is as well, it is a question of context and time for the use of those terms.
I don't have a specific response, but thank you for that observation. That's a helpful thought.
No? Okay.
Yes.
I think I can give you an answer to this question. We have many cases in the early Islamic legislation that the Prophet acted on a way, and then later he acted on another one. And the ulama, the scholars, had opinions in that case. Then they changed their mind and acted in another way. Well, it is a very tricky question. What have I to follow? The Prophet withdrew from the first action and was because his behavior was another one, a valid one. The legal scholars say there is nothing wrong in that. We follow the Sunnah, and we follow the scholars and the Sunnah. What happened, it was only contradiction in their opinions. It was only ikhtilaf fi ra'y. And with this explanation, there are no tricky questions.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's thank our speakers for that.